we started the live stream. So an interesting thing about one of the hormones that she talks about, cortisol, it's an absolutely necessary hormone that your body produces. Some people naturally don't produce enough of it, and when you have that, it's called Addison's disease. There was a very famous president who suffered from Addison's disease. Does anyone know who that is?
What is it?
No. Good guess, but no. It was John F. Kennedy. And it's one of the reasons that he had a lot of back problems, and maybe one of the reasons that he actually got killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, because it causes degeneration in the discs. But one of the things that you might think about is because he had such low levels of cortisol, was he less stress reactive during things like the Cuban Missile Crisis? I mean, by all outward studies of this event, and if you haven't read about the Cuban Missile Crisis, you should, because it was a seminal event in American history. He navigated that crisis, which almost brought us to the precipice of war in a way that was fundamentally highly successful. But it also was highly risky because it involved blockading off Cuba, which had already received some nuclear technology and was sitting only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, right? The Russians had intended to put in ICBMs in our hemisphere to make it easier for us during this bipolar world for them to reach critical targets like Washington, D.C. in a first strike scenario and cripple our ability to strike back. And so there's this enormously problematic, we can't let them do this, but they'd already gotten a lot of it there. And how are we going to deal with this? And who was going to blink first? And it turns out that the Russians blinked first in that instance. So he had low levels of cortisol. One of the things that led to, so Addison's disease, he suffered from this all of his life. And there is evidence to suggest that JFK also had high levels of testosterone, right? I mean, we didn't test him, but his outward behavior suggests that there were high levels of testosterone. So he had this degenerative back condition. He was wearing a back brace. The first shot wouldn't have been fatal, but because he was wearing the back brace when he was shot, most people would have gone down and stayed down, and he was held straight up in the back of the Cadillac as it was making its way through Dealey Plaza in Dallas. You can go see this, by the way, if you haven't been there. It's a really interesting museum to go to. The Texas School Book Depository, where the sniper's nest was. They have a museum on that floor in Dallas. It's in downtown. It's kind of an interesting part of town in the warehouse district, which has become kind of like a little bit like Bricktown is in Oklahoma City. So that's one example. So if you have too little cortisol, you get Addison's disease. If you have too much, you end up with another symptom, which is called Cushing's disease, and that can be also problematic. Horses, oftentimes, particularly older horses, suffer from Cushing's syndrome as a result of cortisol. So she talked about, and one of the things that you should think about in this is you think about how you can use this science to develop your own integrated marketing communication plan is, and we've had this debate before a little bit when we talked about ethics and marketing, that there seems to be a difference between the genders in this, that men seem to be far more willing to do this, right, in class. Is that a nature or a nurture characteristic?
Nature.
You think it's, who says nature? Why do you think it's nature?
Because, historically, men have been more dominant.
Who have?
Men.
Historically, well, how is that nature? Is that social conditioning or is it biological?
Social conditioning.
You think it's biological? Okay.
Professor.
Yeah.
I think it's biological because what Bible says, like the story from Adam and Eve, that the Eve was created from Adam and that kind of. I would say it's nature.
We know, right? that, I mean, for those of us who have studied the Bible and hold very dear to this book, the Bible is largely allegory, right? We know that literally God did not create the world in 7 24-hour periods. I mean, there are people that believe this. It's just not supported by the scientific evidence. The Bible is the word of God through the words of man speaking in the idiom of his time. And so I think when we think about that kind of argument, we have to think about what ancient man understood about our biological. For example, one of the things that the Bible tells us is there's the story of Onan in the Bible. Anybody know that story? The Bible tells us in the story of Onan that Onan spills his seed upon the earth and God strikes him dead. Ancient people thought that all of nascent life was contained in the male. Women had nothing to do with it other than as an incubator. That's not what we understand modern biological science to be, right? And so when we think about the strength of individuals, you are correct. If we take two individuals, one male, one female, and they're roughly the same sizes, and we talked about this when we talked about ethics, in terms of their body makeup, and we send them off to the gym, who's going to put on muscle mass more quickly? Well, it's going to be the male. Who's going to lose fat more quickly? It's going to be the male, right? But we ought not be too quick to leap to the conclusion that that is a characteristic of strength. At the end of 1 year, every year there are roughly equal numbers of male and female babies born, and usually most years there's slightly more females than there are males. Why is that? Male babies tend to be weaker. Actually, they tend to be more fragile. And they tend to die more of things like sudden infant death syndrome. So have we conditioned women over the centuries to be less dominant? Or is there a biological component to it?
So maybe it goes back to primates, where generally the male animal is in charge of pretty much everything else, while the female is just back and being the caretaker in just one area at once. The male is generally more in charge of everything else.
Okay.
Professor, maybe it could be just we think it that way. Maybe they are not.
Maybe they're not.
It's
Okay.
it's just how we think about it.
I think in a lot of animals, the woman or the female is usually the flashier, more beautiful, like bigger one. And I think that so that makes it more nurture in the human situation, because usually the females are the more outgoing, bigger, brighter, more obvious ones, like in birds and stuff.
That's true. Birds, females tend to be bigger. The males tend to be brighter in terms of plumage. Males tend to be smaller, but like in peacocks, right? There's no such thing as a female peacock. They're called peafowl, if you want to talk about both species. And a female peafowl is a peahen. And who has all of the plumage? It's the male that has all of the plumage.
I think it's both nurture and nature.
Okay.
Because men tend to have higher testosterone than women, and nature, society has for a long time put men into roles of power.
Okay. I think you could argue that. I mean, obviously the X chromosome does mean that we have higher levels of testosterone naturally, maybe. So with that, what can we do to overcome that? Well, what would Amy J. Cuddy say you should do to overcome it?
You become it.
You engage in power posing. You engage in situations where you have to become powerful. And you can do this. It's not just, they've done studies in education. When my mother was getting her master's degree in education, they did these studies that I don't know that they could do today with high school students, because this was back in the late 1960s and early 1970s. She was working on a master's degree in education, and they did this in poor school districts. They went in and they took kids that were sort of the ones that were in trouble a lot, that were in the principal's office, and they said, look, just for 1 week, we want to ask you, what makes a good student? And they said things like, well, the good students all sit on the front row. And that is true, by the way. Like, good students tend to, I mean, historically, I used to say this was the A, the B, the C, the D, and the F row. And I could look at somebody's notes and tell whether or not they were going to do well in my class or not. And most of those people had a tendency to sit on the front row. They had a tendency to raise their hand. And so they asked these kids about what makes a good student. They're like, well, they sit on the front row, they raise their hand, they talk, they're not blowing spit wads at the blackboard. And they said, well, we want you to do that for 1 week. And about 60% of them, after the 1 week, continued to mimic that behavior and made changes in their lives. Our minds affect our bodies. We've known that for a long time. How can your mind affect your body? What are examples of your mind affecting your body?
Maybe your thoughts that you have, for instance, of yourself. If you don't think you're capable of something, that's kind of in your mind, so therefore you'll reflect that in your behavior.
Yeah, if you don't think you can do it, you can't. Right? I mean, if you tell yourself I can't do this, you can't. That's absolutely true. Yeah.
There are times like when my thoughts and stuff can like literally make me sick. Like I can make myself sick.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the best example. People can literally, if you think you're going to be sick, you will get sick. I mean, you can literally make yourself physically ill. It's possible to make yourself, the easiest one to do is to work yourself up into a frenzy from anxiety and become have a lot of gastrointestinal issues. I mean, that's the easiest one. But you can also just, you're determined that like you've been around a whole bunch of sick people at a hospital all of a sudden. If you're like Sheldon Cooper, any of you watch The Big Bang Theory, right? Sheldon is horrified of hospitals. He doesn't like germs. And he's convinced that if he goes to the hospital, he's going to get sick and die. And you could do that. You can, if you think that you're going to get, that you're going to, get the flu or whatever, you may not necessarily have the flu, but you can start developing symptoms of various illnesses. Now, I don't think that we should take this to an extreme. If you made an argument ad absurdum, you could say, well, COVID is all in our, and people do this, by the way. They go to it's all in your mind, and there's no such thing, and it's a hoax, and let's not do that, right? Let's not go that far with it. But yes, now what she's saying is that our bodies can also affect our mind. So it goes both ways. How can you do this in your own personal lives before you go into a job interview? And one of the things that I have stressed in here is that you should go on job interviews. You should apply for jobs. And you should go on that. And I want to talk about that in a minute, because it's the one time people are actually really interested in you. Now, you don't want to go into the job interview, as she said, when they said, do you want to go in and throw your feet up on the desk and kick back? No, you don't want to do that. But where can you do this? You can even do this in your car on the way to the job interview. I see how a lot of you pull into the parking lot and you're slumped down in your car and you lay your seat back, put the seat back more forward, sit up straight in the car, tighten your stomach muscles so that you're seated at a more erect angle. Put your shoulders back, and on the drive to the job interview, do this. Practice it in your car. to get the job interview, since we're talking about integrated marketing communication for yourself, what should you do with regard to your resume in the job interview? Now, students oftentimes, they're like, well, you're telling me to lie. No, don't lie. You will be found out if you lie on a resume. I can guarantee it. But what should you do for every single job that you apply for in terms of your resume?
Tailor it.
I think you should absolutely tailor the resume for the job. That is absolutely correct. Look at the job description, look at the qualifications that they want, and stress those qualifications. People put together a resume and they shoot it out in the hundreds. And right now, I'm going to tell you that will work. Because the job market is so tight right now, they're desperate to hire people into most jobs. But when that, and it will switch, right? I mean, things are cyclical in the economy. We go through periods where we have enormous economic growth and prosperity, and then we go through periods where we go into recessions and things like that. Currently, right now, as a result of a number of factors coming together in sort of what we might term a perfect storm, it has allowed for workers to recoup some of the advantages that they had only after enormous struggles and the formation of labor unions at the early part of the Industrial Revolution. We're now seeing that workers have the bargaining capability that we have not seen since the 1950s, when labor unions were a dominant force in American society. And it's because there's this shortage of labor. There's, these people that are just, leaving the workforce in droves. What's causing that? And why do I say it's a perfect storm? Well, we had COVID, so you have all of these people who are now working from home. They figured out that they can work from home. Companies are having a hard time getting them to come back. And if they insist, my brother works for Goldman Sachs. One of the last of what we might call the button-down coat and tie banking firms in America was Goldman. When my brother started at Goldman, everybody was expected to wear a shirt and tie and coat every single day. They can't require that anymore. I mean, like their employees are like, not doing it. Just not coming back to the office either. We figured out that we can work at home and we don't need to go to the office. And so Goldman, which was absolutely adamant when my brother started that there would be no telework, there would be no telecommuting, has started to have to allow people to do that. What's led to a big portion of that? Well, like I said, we had COVID, which allowed companies were forced to deal with things that they didn't want to deal with or to make accommodations that they would not have made in the past. The second thing that's led to it is the aging of America. You have a whole lot of people that are beginning to get to be my age and older who are just retiring. And their COVID was maybe they were going to hang on for a few more years to try and increase their 401k or 403b, but they figured out that they can retire now and they're just retiring. And it means there's a huge number of people exiting the workforce. This is particularly true in the health professions, right? Where nursing has become so stressful and there's just not enough people coming into those professions to take over their roles. And then there's just been a huge shift in terms of even in upper management now, we've finally got enough of a critical mass of the traditionalists retiring. So we have 5 generations in the workforce now. And we had these traditionalists which hung on to the idea that if you weren't there slaving away at the job, you weren't being productive. And you've now replaced a lot of those people with my generation, Generation X was the first generation to say, I'm not living to work. I work to live. I'm not gonna do that. I had a boss when I was in the private sector. He was a traditionalist. He thought, we should work 80 hours a week and you should love it. Well, it was because he hated his family and he wanted to get away from them. Right? I don't hate my family and I don't want to get away from them. And so we've now seen this point at which you've now achieved a critical mass in upper level C-suite executive positions that recognize that most people don't live to work, that they work to live. Let's see. What else? Oh, risk-taking. She talked about risk-taking behavior. So one of the things that they talk about is you do the power posing, you do this in a lab, then they give you the opportunity to gamble. And generally speaking, that is indicative of more high power or people who display more levels of testosterone. Can you think of one profession where you have a lot of power that is risk adverse by nature? But it tends to be a profession that attracts a lot of alpha types, but is not engaged in a lot of risky behavior.
President of the university.
President of the university, why do you say that? You've already got two, sorry, but why do you think the president of the university?
I think that can be applied into that kind of job.
Okay,
Stockbroker.
stockbroker,
I was gonna say that.
I think a lot of them, do you have two or just one? I think a lot of them do engage in risky behavior. If you look at the stock market and the historic crashes, but I will buy that. I mean, a lot of investment bankers particularly were very risk adverse, right? I mean, they tend to look for investments that are very safe. The one that I think is probably the most apropos is the profession that I started out in, which is attorney. Attorneys are absolutely risk adverse. Law school is all about avoiding risk, and there are lots and lots of risks out there that you see. And when you go to law school, the first semester you take something called torts, and you learn to spot, and everything literally becomes a tort. Right? I mean, you start looking around and it's like, oh my God, this carpet, oh, this is like a nightmare waiting to happen, because these little edges, this is not laid out in one long sheet. It's all these little squares that they can pull up. Why do they have those? Because it's easier to replace one square if it gets dirty or soiled than it is to replace the whole room. But a lot of times the little edges of these things will start to curl up, and that's just a tort waiting to happen, because that's just a slip and fall away from somebody breaking a hip. So you see all of these, so attorneys, but they tend to be in high-powered positions. So we talked about your resume. What about how you should engage in integrated marketing communication on your social media? What should you do in terms of your social media to engage in good integrated marketing communication? You're going to tailor your resume so that every job, so you're going to look at those qualifications. And for example, what I do when I apply for jobs, when I went on the market and I became a professor, I applied to a wide variety of schools, everything from heavily research intensive schools to teaching institutions like UCO. And if I was applying to research heavy schools, I didn't focus on the fact that I have all of these awards as a classroom teacher, because they don't care about that. What they cared about, and what I put up on my resume, I moved up in my resume, was all of the research that I had done, all of the papers that I had published, because that's the thing that they care about. When I applied for UCO, that's not really what we care about so much here, because we're not a research school. We are a teaching institution. We're not even a balanced institution. So what did I put? Well, I put all of the stuff that I'd done in terms of teaching, all of the different types. I started out teaching, and the way I got my first job teaching was they figured that I was young and could teach online. So I started in the early ages of teaching online. At that point in time, we used to have a big correspondence office. So the way most people did distance learning was they would buy the correspondence course from the university, they would get the book, and then they would literally, I know this is hard for you to imagine, they would mail assignments back and forth, and they would have to either come to campus to take exams or arrange for an exam to be sent, if they were in the military, to a library where they could be proctored. And then that person, the proctor, would pick up the exam and they would mail it back to the university. That's how we did distance education. when I started. So the internet was in its infancy in terms of being able to use it for distance learning. And they thought, well, he could do that, right? I mean, he's young, he'll figure it out. And that's what I did. I figured out how to teach online. And it was basically at that point in time, a glorified correspondence course. Because it was just an alternative delivery. But you know, we didn't have all the video capabilities and all of the abilities to really engage in assessment and measurement and all of that. And so, you know, I focused on, when I got the job here at UCO, all of those kinds of things that I had been engaged in online learning for 20-something years. And that I had written papers. One of the things that we're heavily interested in here at UCO is transformative learning. And so I focused on the fact that I had written all of these papers in pedagogy and marketing on basically flipped classroom type behavior. So those are the kinds of things that you can do. Now, how do we translate that into our social media? Because if you think that the employers are not going to go out and creep on your social media, they are. And even if you have your settings set to the point where you can lock them down, one of the things that happened with a bunch of people that got fired was Facebook made some updates in the early days of Facebook, and all of these people had set their profiles to private so that their employers could not see their Facebook. And Facebook did these updates, and all of a sudden it reset everybody's Facebook account to the default setting. And the default setting is to make everything public. Why is that? Why does Facebook want to make everything public? Because the more public you are, the more people will see your stuff, the more they're likely to engage with the platform, and that adds more value, right? It adds more data points to Facebook. What makes Facebook valuable? The average person, if you don't have a Facebook account, and this was 10 or 15 years ago, and I told you all this before, but its redundancy is good. If you don't have a Facebook account, the average person, Facebook has 5, and this was 10 years ago, 5,000 to 7,000 data points on that individual who has no Facebook account. Simply by going out and aggregating big data from publicly available sources, they have all of this. Now, if you have a Facebook account, how many data points do they have on you?
A lot more.
A lot. And if your account is set to public, they have even more data points on you, right? Mine has always been set to public, and they have an enormous, because that means that friends of friends can like and comment on my photos, right? Which allows them to track all of that kind of behavior to see what it is that you're interested in, what they're interested in, what they like and dislike. So how can you use integrated marketing communication to make sure that you're maximizing your social media presence? So we're gonna tailor our resume. Now, how are we gonna tailor our social media? So that you're engaged in good integrated marketing communication. Should you post the party pics of you at the frat house with the beer bong as your profile picture?
Obviously not.
Probably not. Like, you know, I'm there may be a career out there where that's what they want, you know, but I'm gonna guess that most companies don't want that person. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say that was kind of job dependent, because in just some hypothetical situation, if you were like a party host, they would probably go for the person who had like a lot of fun stuff on his social media account. But normally, you should probably like keep you can say like deep opinions away and stuff. Like say if it's over transgender or a lot of other stuff that comes to yourself on your social media too.
Yeah, I think I think one of the things that I do on my social media, and I started out as a political scientist, and it is really hard for me not, because I was a political scientist for so long, not to post political stuff on my Facebook account. But I'm no longer a political scientist, I'm a marketer. And I'm worried about, like students and getting students jobs and things like that. So I don't post anything, about, and I don't like people's posts where they start, every once in a while as a lawyer, I will post something like, the first duty of government is to protect the powerless from the powerful, the Code of Hammurabi, the world's oldest living code. I think that's pretty hard to disagree with, right? Even dictators say things, even dictators talk about democracy and the people. They may not act that way, but they still talk about it. So what do I post on my Facebook? Well, I'm an animal rehabber. I've rehabbed all kinds of squirrels and raccoons and things like that. Got 2 prairie dogs currently. There's lots of posts about prairie. Everybody loves prairie dogs. They're non-controversial, right? They're just cute little creatures that love, to run around and wreak havoc. Nothing controversial about a prairie dog. Now, if you're a political scientist, maybe you want to engage in the public debate, right, about that.
I think it also depends on the person's angle. For example, me, I like marketing. I'm studying marketing. I want to be a marketer, so I will only post stuff that is related to marketing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think if I post stuff about sales competitions and things like that. My YouTube channel is pretty much devoted to posting videos about marketing, and my class discussions. It's about this class, right? Now I also have some how-to videos on there. The number 1 video that I have on my YouTube channel was actually, I have a Dodge Ram 3500 it's a dually. And when you have the mirrors out, people, like if it's parked on the street, tend to hit the mirrors. And if you have a big truck like this happens frequently. They'll hit the mirror and knock it and break it. Even though it's supposed to bend and flex, they'll break the mirror. And the first one I had replaced, it was like, I think $1,100 to take it to the dealership and have it replaced. I'm like, that's crazy. I can do this myself, right? And so I got online. I found a YouTube video of somebody replacing the mirror on a Dodge Ram 3500, and then I made my own video. And I think that video has it's the most of any of them that I have, the views. It's got like 400 or 500 views of that video. How to fix your car. Oh, I also replaced in my aunt's Toyota the air conditioning fan, and that one got like several hundred views. So I do post a few of those things like that. But by and large, primarily, I'm a marketer. My YouTube channel, and I use this when I have applied for jobs. I tell them, and they're like, "Wow, that's great." We shared it. We shared your YouTube with everybody because they knew what they were getting in terms of a classroom teacher long before I even set foot on campus. All right. Well, we'll talk about advertising and the media of advertising on Thursday, and then we'll move into professional sales next week.